My name is Mark. I'm 48 years old now, but this happened 5 years ago. I live in a small, tidy suburb south of Lansing, where the biggest predator is a fat raccoon that gets into the garbage cans. The closest thing I have to a forest is the manicured park down the street, with its wood chip trails and signs that tell you to please keep your dog on a leash. I haven't been north of Clare since it happened. I sold my rifle, my shotgun, all of it. I can't even stand the smell of gun oil anymore. It takes me right back. Before all this, I was a different man. I was born and raised in Ironwood, deep in the western Upper Peninsula. The woods weren't a place for recreation to me. They were just a part of my life, as natural as breathing. I spent 10 years as a volunteer on the county search and rescue team. I've seen what the wilderness can do. I've found people who got lost and died of exposure just 100 yards from a trail.
I've seen what a black bear can do to a deer carcass, or even a person. I thought I knew the woods. I thought I understood the rules. The trip was an annual tradition, the second week of November, rifle season. For 15 years, my best friend Cal and I had gone up to his family's old cabin. It was tucked away in the Ottawa National Forest, miles down a gravel road that turned into a 2-track barely wide enough for his truck. There was no electricity, no running water, just a hand pump for the well outside and a big stone fireplace inside. It was perfect. It was our escape from jobs, from responsibilities, from the noise of the world. It was a place of quiet camaraderie, of cold mornings in a deer blind and long evenings playing cards by the light of a kerosene lamp. This time was a little different. Cal had brought along his younger brother, Brian, and Brian's new girlfriend, Megan. Cal and I were the same age, both cut from that same rugged UP cloth. Brian was 10 years younger, with a city sensibility he'd picked up going to college downstate. He was a good kid, but he always had a joke, always treated our trip like a bit of a rustic novelty. Megan was from Grand Rapids. She was sweet, but you could tell she was completely out of her element. She'd shown up in brand new boots and a designer parka that probably cost more than my first truck. I remember Cal pulling me aside as we loaded the gear. He'd said, "Hey, go easy on them. It's their first time up here. Ryan wants to show her the real Michigan." We both knew what that meant. He wanted to play the rugged outdoorsman for his city girlfriend. The first day was exactly as it should have been. We got the cabin opened up, aired out the musty smell of a place that had been closed for a year. We chopped wood, primed the pump, and Cal and I went out for a late afternoon hunt. We were lucky. Cal dropped a decent-sized 8-point buck about a half-mile from the cabin. We field-dressed it there in the fading light, the steam rising from the carcass into the frigid air. We hung it from a thick pine branch back at the cabin, high enough to be safe from any curious scavengers. That night we sat around the fire, eating venison chili that Cal's wife had made for us. Brian was telling jokes, Megan was laughing, and the warm glow of the lamp pushed back the immense, silent darkness that pressed in on our little cabin from all sides. It felt safe. It felt normal. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence. After we'd turned in for the night, I lay awake for a while, a habit from my SAR days. I was listening. Usually, even in the deep cold of November, you hear something. The hoot of a barred owl, the distant yip of a coyote pack, the rustle of a mouse in the walls. That night, there was nothing. It was a dead, heavy silence that felt unnatural, like the entire forest was holding its breath. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a big storm, but the sky had been crystal clear, filled with a billion sharp, cold stars. I told myself it was just the cold, that the animals were hunkered down. I tried to dismiss the unease coiling in my gut. Then I heard the sound. It came from the direction of the river to the west of the cabin. It was a heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of a four-legged animal. I've spent my life in the woods,
I know the gaits of deer, bear, moose, wolves. This was different. This was the sound of something heavy, something bipedal, walking with a steady, deliberate pace. It was too heavy for a man. The impacts were deep, resonating through the frozen ground. I sat up on my cot, straining to hear. The sound continued for maybe a minute, moving parallel to the cabin, but staying deep in the tree line before it faded away. In the morning, I mentioned it. We were all sitting around the small wooden table, drinking coffee that was thick enough to stand a spoon in. "Did anyone else hear something strange last night?" I asked. Brian, of course, immediately smirked. "Don't tell me you're getting spooked, Mark. It was probably Bigfoot coming to say hello." He winked at Megan, who giggled nervously. Cal was more thoughtful. He rubbed the stubble on his chin. "I heard it too," he said. "Woke me up. Sounded like a moose, maybe, but the rhythm was off." We talked it over for a few minutes. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs for a short distance, though none of us had ever heard of one doing it for so long or with such a heavy tread. We rationalized. We had to. The alternative was to admit that something was out there in the dark that we didn't understand. We settled on the moose theory, even though it felt thin, and went about our day. The second sign was the deer. Cal and I went out to check on the buck we'd hung. It was gone, not just pulled down and dragged off. The thick 2-inch rope we had used, a rope rated to several thousand pounds, had been snapped. It wasn't chewed through. The ends were frayed, as if it had been stretched to its breaking point and then just popped. The carcass itself had vanished. We spent an hour searching the area. A bear would have dragged it, leaving a clear trail of disturbed leaves and broken branches. A pack of wolves would have left blood and scraps everywhere. There was nothing. No drag marks, no blood trail. Just a few deep, ambiguous tracks in the hard ground near the tree. Tracks that were quickly becoming obscured as the morning sun softened the frozen earth. They were huge, bigger than any bear track I'd ever seen. And they were elongated, almost like a massive human footprint, but with a shape that was subtly wrong. Cal and I looked at each other. The easy confidence of the morning was gone, replaced by a cold, prickling caution. "No bear did this," I said, my voice low. Cal just shook his head slowly. No bear I've ever seen." Brian and Megan came over to see what was wrong. When we told him the deer was gone, Brian's first instinct was to blame people. "It has to be poachers," he insisted. "Someone must have seen us bring it in and came back for it last night." It was a logical explanation, the only one that made any sense, but it didn't account for the snapped rope or the lack of a trail, and it didn't explain the feeling I had, the deep, primal instinct screaming at me that we were being watched. I felt it on the back of my neck, a cold weight of unseen eyes following our movements from the dark shadows of the pines. We spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alert. The easygoing atmosphere was shattered. We stuck close to the cabin. I cleaned my rifle 3 times, a nervous habit. Cal kept scanning the tree line, his hand never far from the hunting knife on his belt. Brian tried to keep the mood light, making jokes, but they fell flat. Even he could feel the tension. Megan was quiet, her face pale. She just wanted to go home. Brian promised her we'd pack up and leave first thing in the morning. He said it was just a precaution, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. He was finally starting to understand that this wasn't a game. As dusk began to settle, the temperature plummeted. The woods grew dark with a startling swiftness. We built up the fire until the inside of the cabin was almost too hot, a tiny fortress of light and warmth against the encroaching cold and the immense, listening darkness. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the clinking of forks against plates. Every gust of wind that rattled the old window panes made us jump. The silence from the night before returned, even more profound, more absolute. It felt like we were the only living things for 100 miles. The sound started again around 9 o'clock. This time, they were closer. It began with a faint scratching sound, like a branch being dragged against the cabin's western wall. It was a long, slow scrape, followed by silence. We all froze, looking at each other across the table. "It's just a branch," Brian whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Then we heard a sniff, a loud, wet, snuffling sound right outside the main door. It was deep and guttural, the sound of a massive animal trying to catch our scent from under the door. Megan let out a small, strangled gasp and clapped a hand over her mouth. Cal and I moved without speaking. We grabbed our rifles from the corner. We didn't chamber around yet. We didn't want the metallic click to give us away. We were still operating under the assumption that this was a bear, a very large and very bold bear. I crept to the small, grimy window next to the fireplace, the one that looked out toward the front porch. I wiped a small circle clear in the condensation with my sleeve and peered out. The moon was high and bright, casting a pale, skeletal light over the snow-dusted clearing. For a moment, I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees and the woodpile. Then, it moved. It stepped out from the shadow of a massive white pine at the edge of the clearing. It was just a silhouette, a black shape against the slightly less black forest. But it was enough. My blood went cold. It was impossibly tall, standing on 2 legs. It had to be over 7 feet. The shoulders were immense, a solid block of muscle that dwarfed the proportions of any man. Its arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees. But the head was the thing that broke my mind. It was long, with a distinct canine snout and pointed ears that stood erect against the moonlight. It turned its head slowly, scanning the cabin, and I saw the profile clearly. It was the head of a wolf, perched atop the torso of a monster. It took another step, and the gait was wrong. The legs were bent backward, like a dog's, but it walked upright with a fluid, unnatural grace. It was the source of the thumping sound. This was no bear. This was no man in a suit. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Cal," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Get away from the door." Cal looked at my face, at the sheer terror that must have been written there, and he immediately backed away, raising his rifle. Brian stared at me, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "What is it? What did you see?" Before I could answer, the doorknob began to jiggle, slowly, deliberately, up and down, up and down. A soft metallic rattle in the dead quiet of the cabin. Whatever was out there wasn't just a dumb animal. It was testing the door. It knew what a doorknob was for. The jiggling stopped. A moment of absolute silence followed. Then came a sound that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very logs of the cabin walls. It was a sound of pure, intelligent malice. It was followed by a slam, a single titanic impact against the heavy oak door that shook the entire structure. Dust rained down from the rafters. A jar on the shelf fell and shattered on the floor. Megan screamed, a raw, piercing shriek of pure terror. This was the moment that broke Brian.
His fear curdled into a kind of panicked, foolish anger. He still couldn't accept it.
His mind couldn't process the reality of what was happening.
"It's a person!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "It's some psycho trying to scare us!"
He started toward the door. "Brian, no!" Cal shouted, grabbing for his arm, but Brian shook him off. "I'm not going to let some jerk terrorize us." He reached the door, his hands trembling. He unlatched the heavy deadbolt we had thrown earlier.
"Get away from our cabin!" he screamed at the door. "Don't open it!"
I yelled, moving towards him, but I was too late. He didn't throw the door wide, he just opened it a crack, maybe 2 inches, to yell out into the darkness. It was the last mistake he ever made. The instant the latch cleared the frame, the door was ripped inward with unimaginable force. It tore off its iron hinges with a scream of tortured metal and splintering wood and flew across the room, smashing against the far wall. In the rectangle of night that was now our doorway stood the creature.
The spill from our lantern illuminated it, and the reality was 1,000 times worse than the silhouette. It was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, covered in coarse, matted fur the color of charcoal and dead leaves. Its chest and shoulders were impossibly broad, tapering down to a lean, powerful waist. The legs were bent in that canine way, ending in large, clawed feet. The arms were what terrified me the most. They were grotesquely long and corded with thick, ropey muscle, ending in huge, 5-fingered hands that looked disturbingly human, except for the thick, yellowed claws that tipped each finger. And the head was a perfect, monstrous wolf's head, with a long muzzle pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing rows of thick, yellow fangs. Its eyes glowed with a faint, internal yellow light. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent. They were full of hate. It all happened in a second. Before Brian could even react, one of those long arms shot into the cabin.
The clawed hand clamped down on the front of his jacket, the fabric tearing like paper. It lifted him off his feet as if he weighed nothing and pulled him out into the night. We heard one choked, terrified scream, and then it was cut short. Megan's continuous, high-pitched shrieking filled the cabin, a sound of pure, mindless panic. Cal and I reacted on instinct. We brought our rifles up and fired. The roar of the .30-06 and the .270 inside the small cabin was deafening. We didn't aim. We just shot into the darkness where Brian had been taken. The creature was gone. It had moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. I scrambled to the ruined doorway, my ears ringing, and peered out. In the moonlight, I could see it. It was 20 yards out near the trees. It was holding Brian's limp body in front of itself like a shield. It looked directly at us. It knew we wouldn't shoot our friend, or what was left of him. Then, with a contemptuous flick of its wrist, it tossed Brian's body aside. It hit the ground with a sickening, final thud. The creature lowered itself into a crouch, and then it charged. It didn't run like a man or an ape. It ran on 2 legs, but with a loping, predatory gait, its long arms swinging, claws extended, covering the ground with terrifying speed. Cal fired again. I heard the bullet hit with a wet, heavy smack. The creature grunted, a deep sound of pain and rage, but it didn't slow down. It was almost at the door. I slammed my shoulder into what was left of the doorframe and fired from the hip. The muzzle flash lit up its snarling face, the yellow eyes burning with fury. My shot went wide. It was too close. It swiped at me with one of its massive hands. I threw myself backward, tripping over a loose floorboard and crashing to the ground. I felt the wind of the blow as its claws passed inches from my face. They hit the log wall next to the doorway, gouging out deep furrows in the solid wood as if it were soft clay. Cal was a better man than me in a crisis. He didn't panic. As the creature was focused on me, he stepped forward and jammed the barrel of his rifle into its side, right below the ribs, and pulled the trigger. The blast was muffled,
The creature roared, a sound that was not wolf or bear or anything I had ever heard. It was a sound of agony and fury that shook the very air. It spun around, backhanding Cal and sending him flying across the room. He hit the stone fireplace with a sickening crack and slumped to the floor, motionless. His rifle clattered away into a corner. Now it was just me and Megan. She was still screaming, huddled in the corner, useless with terror. The creature stood in the doorway, breathing in heavy, ragged snorts. Dark blood was welling from the wound in its side, but it seemed more enraged than injured. It took a step into the cabin.
I scrambled backward, crab walking away, trying to get my rifle back up.
It took another step, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on me. It was ignoring Megan completely. I was the threat. It knew it. This was when its intelligence became truly terrifying. It didn't just rush me. It paused, its head cocked, and looked around the cabin. Its gaze fell on the large window on the opposite wall. Then it looked back at me. It was calculating. It was developing a strategy. It backed out of the doorway, disappearing into the darkness. For a heartbeat, I thought it was leaving, retreating from its wounds. I was wrong. A second later, there was a deafening crash as the window on the far side of the cabin exploded inward, spraying glass and splintered wood across the floor. A second one. There was a second creature. It was slightly smaller than the first, but no less terrifying. It clambered through the shattered window frame, its movements unnaturally fluid. We were being flanked.
They were hunting us like a pack. They were coordinating.
My blood ran cold with the realization. This wasn't a random attack by a lone, rabid animal. This was a planned hunt by intelligent predators. The first creature reappeared in the doorway, blocking our only escape route. They had us in a pincer. I was on the floor, my rifle in my hands, but with no clear shot. Megan's screaming had devolved into a series of horrified, sobbing gasps. The new creature, the smaller one, began to move toward her. The big one, the one Cal had shot, took a slow, deliberate step toward me. It was limping slightly, favoring its wounded side. Its eyes never left mine. The hatred in them was a physical force. I knew we were going to die. The thought was strangely calm and clear in my mind. There was no escape. But I wasn't going to die on the floor like a dog. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, bracing my back against the leg of the table. I raised my rifle.
The creature in the doorway let out a low growl. It was a warning. It was telling me to put the weapon down. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was Cal. He was stirring. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his face a mask of pain. Blood was trickling from a cut on his forehead. He saw the situation in an instant. Me pinned down, Megan about to be taken, and two of those things in the cabin. His eyes found his rifle, lying a few feet away from him, near the fireplace. The smaller creature was focused on Megan, its back mostly to him. The larger one was focused on me. Cal made a choice. He didn't try to crawl for his rifle. He wouldn't have made it. Instead, he looked at me. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he yelled, a loud, defiant roar of a word. "Hey!" Both creatures turned their heads toward the sound. In that split second of distraction, Cal launched himself, not at the creatures, but at the heavy, cast-iron poker resting on the hearth. He got his hand on it and, with a final, desperate surge of strength, he threw it. He wasn't aiming for the creatures. He was aiming for the main kerosene lamp sitting on the table. The heavy iron poker smashed into the glass base of the lamp. It shattered, and for a fraction of a second, the flames seemed to die. Then the spilled kerosene ignited. A fireball erupted in the center of the cabin. The flames shot up to the ceiling, instantly catching the dry wooden rafters. The smaller creature, which had been right next to the table, shrieked as the flames washed over it. It was a high, piercing sound of agony. It staggered back, beating at the flames that now clung to the fur on its arm and chest. This was our chance. The cabin was filling with thick, black smoke. The fire was spreading with incredible speed. "Megan, move!" I screamed, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. The larger creature, momentarily stunned by the sudden inferno, was now roaring in fury. It was trapped on the other side of a wall of fire. The second one, still screeching and on fire, crashed back out the window it had come through, disappearing into the night. Our only way out was the main doorway, but the big one was still there, a monstrous silhouette against the growing blaze. It was wounded, and now it was cornered. Cal was on his feet, swaying. He picked up a fallen piece of the door, a heavy slab of oak, and charged the creature. It was a suicidal, beautiful, terrible act of bravery. He slammed the wood into the creature's wounded side. The monster howled and swatted him away again, but the path was clear for a second. "Go!" Cal yelled, his voice choked with smoke. "Get her out of here! Go!" I didn't hesitate. I shoved Megan ahead of me, out through the doorway and into the freezing night air. I stumbled after her, choking, my eyes streaming from the smoke. I turned back, rifle ready, expecting the creature to be right behind us. But it wasn't. It was standing over Cal. It looked from him to the fire that was now consuming the cabin, and then out at me. It let out one last frustrated roar that echoed through the trees. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness of the forest. The truck. We had to get to the truck. It was 50 yards away, across the clearing. The keys. Brian had the keys. My mind raced. Then I remembered. Cal always kept a spare set hidden in a magnetic box under the rear bumper. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through me. "Come on," I yelled at Megan, pulling her along. She was stumbling, barely coherent. The run to the truck felt like it took an hour. Every shadow seemed to hold a monster. I kept expecting one of them to burst from the trees and cut us down. The burning cabin behind us cast flickering, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. We reached the truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely feel under the bumper for the key box. I found it, fumbled it open, and got the key. I shoved Megan into the passenger side and scrambled behind the wheel. The engine turned over, the sound roaring to life in the terrified silence. I slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the gas. The tires spun on the frozen ground, then caught. We shot forward, fishtailing down the narrow track away from the burning cabin, away from the nightmare. As we rounded the first bend, the headlights swept across the clearing, and I saw it. One of them. The big one. It was standing at the edge of the woods, next to the tree line. It was standing over Cal's body. He hadn't made it out. The creature looked up, caught in the beams of the headlights. Its yellow eyes seemed to glow with their own light. It wasn't looking at the truck. It was looking right at me. And in those eyes, I saw something that will haunt me forever. It wasn't just animal rage. It was recognition. It was intelligence. It was a promise. Then it bent down, effortlessly lifted Cal's body over its shoulder, and stepped back into the impenetrable darkness of the woods, gone as if it had never been. I drove. I don't know for how long. I just drove, my foot pressed to the floor, the truck bouncing and crashing over the rough road. Megan was catatonic in the seat next to me, just staring straight ahead, tears streaming silently down her face. I drove until the gravel road turned back into pavement, and I kept driving until I saw the first blessed flicker of a cell phone tower on my phone. I pulled over, my body shaking uncontrollably, and I called 911. The rest is a blur of flashing lights, scratchy blankets,
and the flat, disbelieving faces of Michigan state troopers. I tried to tell them what happened. I told them everything from the first sound in the woods to the creature standing over Cal's body. I probably sounded like a lunatic. I was a man in shock, covered in soot, babbling about 7-foot-tall dogmen.
They listened patiently. They took my statement. They were professional, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They sent a team out to the cabin, or what was left of it. By the time they got there, it had burned to the foundation. They found what was left of Brian's body, not far from the cabin. The official report said he was killed and partially consumed by a black bear. They found evidence of a large predator. They found tracks that they said were unclear but consistent with a large black bear. The fire, they concluded, was started by an overturned kerosene lamp, likely knocked over during the panic of the animal attack. My story was written off as a symptom of post-traumatic stress, a hallucination brought on by the horror of witnessing my friends being killed by a bear. They never found Cal. Not a trace. No body, no blood, no scraps of clothing. He was listed as a missing person, presumed to have fled into the woods during the attack and succumbed to the elements.
They searched for a week. They found nothing. They told me it wasn't uncommon in the dense forests of the UP, but I knew he hadn't just wandered off. I knew what had taken him. The case was closed. Bear attack, tragic accident. I was offered counseling. Megan was institutionalized for 6 months. Her parents threatened to sue me for negligence. The official story was neat and tidy. It made sense. It fit into the world they understood. My story did not. About a month after it happened, I got a visit. An old deputy from the county sheriff's department. He was a few weeks from retirement. He came to my house, sat at my kitchen table, and accepted a cup of coffee. He said he was just tying up loose ends before he left the force. He asked me to tell him the story one more time, off the record. So I did. I told him everything, just as it happened. I left nothing out. He listened without interrupting, his old, tired eyes never leaving my face.
When I was finished, he just sat there for a long time, stirring his coffee. The silence stretched on. Finally, he looked up at me. "I'm retiring in 2 weeks," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm going to move to Arizona to live with my daughter. I'm tired of the cold, and I'm tired of the woods." He took a sip of his coffee. "Over my 30 years on the force up here, I've had maybe half a dozen calls like yours. Missing hunters, strange tracks, stories that sound crazy. People who come out of the woods white as a sheet, talking about something tall and fast with the head of a dog. We write it down, we file the report, and we call it a bear or a cougar. Because what else are we supposed to call it?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "My advice to you, son, you sell that cabin. You tell Cal's family you're sorry, but you never want to see that piece of land again. You move south, you find a place with streetlights, and you never, ever go that deep into the woods again. Some things are out there that don't have a name, and they don't like us knowing they're there." He stood up, put his hat on, and thanked me for the coffee. He walked out of my house, and I never saw him again. It was the only time anyone in a position of authority ever acknowledged, even for a second, that I might not have been crazy. So that's what I did. Cal's family, devastated, sold the land to a logging company. I quit my job, sold my house in Ironwood, and moved down here. I tried to go back to my life, but it's impossible. The man I was died in that cabin with my friends. The person who is left is just a ghost. I have nightmares every night. I see those yellow eyes, I hear Megan's screams and the sound of the door being ripped from its hinges. I feel the survivor's guilt like a physical weight on my chest. Why did I live? Why did I run while Cal was fighting? I know logically it's what he wanted, what he sacrificed himself for.
But that doesn't make it any easier to live with. I spend a lot of time online now, in forums and on websites where people tell stories like mine. I read them and I see the same details over and over. The unnatural silence, the immense size, the canine head, the impossible speed and intelligence. I know I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. There are thousands of us, people who have brushed up against something that shouldn't exist and have had our lives shattered by it. We are a quiet, traumatized community, bound together by a terrible truth that the rest of the world refuses to see. The world is not the safe, well-understood place you think it is. The maps are wrong. There are still dark corners, empty spaces where evolution has taken a different path. We think because we have satellites and GPS that we know every inch of this planet. We don't.
There are things that live in the deep woods, ancient and powerful things that have been here long before us and will be here long after we are gone. They watch us from the shadows. They hunt us, and they are very, very real. So, if you are ever out in the wilderness and the woods go silent and you hear something heavy walking on two legs in the dark, don't try to rationalize it. Don't be brave. Don't be a fool like Brian was. You run. You get in your car and you drive and you don't ever look back. You leave the woods to them because you are not the hunter. You are the prey.